This chapter book by Allan Ahlberg is called The Man Who Wore All His Clothes, and it was illustrated by Katharine McEwen. Allan Ahlberg did many books with his wife Janet. Together they did the Jolly Postman books, Peekaboo, many others. Katharine McEwen graduated with a degree in illustration from Kingston University, and she also does picture books and chapter books for young readers. We are now entering a Gaskitts book. Meet the Gaskitts. Mr. Gaskitt is a slim young father who sometimes wears all his clothes. Mrs. Gaskitt is a loving mother and hard-working taxi driver. Gus and Gloria Gaskitt are the 9-year-old twins in the story. Horace, the Gaskitts' cat, likes easy chairs, old movies on TV, and cat food ads. The Gaskitts' refrigerator is a 5-star freezer, large vegetable compartment, and is a good speller. And the Gaskitts' car radio sometimes gets things wrong. Chapter 1. Mr. Gaskitt Gets Dressed. One morning in the month of December, Mr. Gaskitt got up. He put on his t-shirt and underwear and socks, and his socks and t-shirt and underwear, and his underwear and socks and t-shirt. "Great socks, dear," said Mrs. Gaskitt. He put on his 3 shirts and his 2 pairs of pants. "Very smart, Dad," said Gloria. He put on 4 sweaters and a tie. "Cool tie, Dad," Gus said. Meanwhile, Horace had jumped into Mr. Gaskitt's still warm bed. All of a sudden the phone rang. "I want a taxi," said a gruff voice. "Right," said Mrs. Gaskitt. "When for?" "In half an hour, on the dot." "Right," said Mrs. Gaskitt. "Where from?" "Pick me up outside the bank," said the voice. "Right," said Mrs. Gaskitt. "And where will I take you?" "As far away as possible," said the voice. "Only joking, lady." And he hung up. Mr. Gaskitt ate his breakfast. He put on his jacket, his fleece, his overcoat, his 3 scarves, his 2 pairs of gloves, and his plastic raincoat. "Don't forget your hats, dear," said Mrs. Gaskitt. Mr. Gaskitt kissed his wife and children. "Goodbye, darlings." "Bye-bye, Dad," and left the house. Chapter 2. Mr. Gaskitt Gets Stuck. Mr. Gaskitt squeezed into his car. A little snow had begun to fall. He switched on the radio. "Good morning, Mr. Gaspot, or Mr. Gaspill, or Mr. Gaskitt." "I must get that radio fixed," thought Mr. Gaskitt. He drove down the road, around the rotary, and up and over the overpass. He stopped at the traffic lights, red, yellow, green. Meanwhile, Horace had come downstairs and was watching TV in the living room. Mrs. Gaskitt was parked outside the bank. Gus and Gloria were at school watching, oh no, their poor old teacher falling down from a ladder. The teacher's name was Mrs. Fritter. She landed with a dreadful bang, got a big lump on her head, and had to go home. Back in the car, Mr. Gaskitt was stuck in traffic. A truck had tipped over while trying to back up. "Watch out! I am backing up! Beep, beep! I am still backing up! Beep! I am skidding! I am falling over! Beep!" Now the truck's load of Christmas trees was rolling around all over the street. The truck itself was lying on its side. "I am terribly sorry." Mr. Gaskitt sighed and twiddled with his radio. "The roads are clear," the radio said. "No holdups anywhere. A happy Easter to all of our listeners." Chapter 3. Mr. Gaskitt Gets Going Again. The road was clear and the sun was shining. Mr. Gaskitt was on his way again. "Terrible traffic jams," said the radio. "Fog everywhere." "Eat Mrs. Mossop's mince pies." Mr. Gaskitt stopped at the gas station. He got 4 free wine glasses, 3 car stickers, 2 cans of Slug, a giant economy bag of popcorn, and oh yes, some gas. Meanwhile, Horace had left the house and was visiting a friend. Gus and Gloria were getting into trouble with the substitute teacher, whose name was Mr. Blatter. The problem was, Mr. Blatter had not taught for many years. His ways were somewhat, hands on heads, old-fashioned. Meanwhile, also, outside the bank, Mrs. Gaskitt was getting impatient. Just as she was about to leave, Bang! Out of the bank rushed a small man. He had his collar turned up and his hat turned down. He was carrying an enormous bag. "Where to?" said Mrs. Gaskett. The airport," growled the man. "Shall I put your bag in the trunk?" No." The man clutched his bag and looked over his shoulder. "I'd rather hold on to it." Chapter 4. Mrs. Gaskett Smells a Rat. Mr. Gaskett was driving along. "Soon be there now," he said to himself. The radio was playing a rock and roll song. Suddenly a voice said, "We interrupt this rock and roll song with a news flash. There has been a robbery at the bank." "Fancy that," said Mr. Gaskett. "The police are on the lookout for a bad man with a small bog," said the radio. "No, a large man with a bad back." "No, a small bag with a... Oh, dear." Mrs. Gaskett had her radio on, too. "Wow, a robbery at the bank!" she cried. "Dreadful," growled her passenger, and he clutched his bag closer. "You got out of that bank just in time," said Mrs. Gaskett. "Yeah," growled the man. "Lucky, wasn't it?" Just then a police siren began to sound in the street behind them. "Step on it," growled the man. But Mrs. Gaskett was getting suspicious. "Why should I?" "Because I say so," growled the man. Mrs. Gaskett smelled a rat. "Wait a minute. What have you got in that bag?" "Mind your own business," growled the man, and he said, "Turn left." Meanwhile, Gus and Gloria were having more trouble with Mr. Blotter. "Fingers on lips, elbows on knees, left legs behind necks, and over right shoulders," said Mr. Blotter. Meanwhile, also, Horace was at his friend's house watching an old movie. It was a sad old movie. Horace had his hanky out. Suddenly a voice said, "We interrupt this sad old movie with a news flash. There has been a robbery at the bank." Back at the school, the children were setting off for the swimming pool. Mr. Blotter was marching them like soldiers on parade across the playground. Meanwhile, out in the street, the bus was waiting. Chapter 5. Run, Robber, Run. Mr. Gaskett was still driving along, and his radio was still getting things wrong. "The robber is making his getaway on a motorbike," said the radio. Meanwhile, the robber was still in Mrs. Gaskitt's taxi. "The robber is making his getaway on a fire engine," yelled the radio. Meanwhile, Mrs. Gaskett had stopped at the traffic lights, and the robber had jumped out. "The robber is hiding away in his secret den, eating eggs, fries, and beans," hollered the radio. Meanwhile, the robber was wondering what to do next. Just then, he spotted the bus. It was waiting at the traffic lights, too. Small, round faces were pressed against the steamy glass. One or two of them had their tongues out. Meanwhile, Mrs. Gaskett was chasing the robber. "Stop, thief!" she cried. Down the street, the police siren was getting louder. The robber opened the door of the bus and jumped in. Gus and Gloria were sitting on the front seat with their swimming bags. Mr. Blotter stood up in the aisle. "Who are you?" he said. "Mind your own business," growled the man. He said, "Step on it." Chapter 6. "Meow," said Horace. Mr. Gaskett was still driving along. Up ahead, he thought he could see Mrs. Gaskett's taxi. Mrs. Gaskett was running after the bus. She thought she could see Gus and Gloria. Meanwhile, inside the bus, Mr. Blotter was asking, "Well, what's all this? What's going on?" And the children were telling him, "It's a hijack, sir." "A kidnapping." "Ransom." "No, it ain't. It's a joke." "A trick." "He's pulling our leg." Now the robber took charge. From his pocket, he pulled a gun. Well, a toy gun, actually. The one he'd used in the bank. "That ain't real," yelled the children. "I got one of them." "It's plastic." "Silence," growled the robber. "Blasted kids." And he said, "Fingers on lips, hands on heads." He was old-fashioned, too. Then to Mr. Blotter he said, "And you." And to the driver, "Drive." The chase began. The bus drove down the street. Mrs. Gaskett in her taxi chased after it. Mr. Gaskett in his car chased after her, and the police chased after him, and the TV news reporter with her TV cameraman and her TV van, chased after them. Meanwhile, Horace was at his friend's house watching TV. It was a cat food ad for crunchy mice, Horace's favorite food. Suddenly a voice said, "We interrupt this cat food ad for crunchy mice with live coverage of a police chase." "Meow," said Horace. Chapter 7. The Unhappy Robber. The bus went up the hill and down the hill. The children began to whisper. Psst, 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 psst. Under the underpass and out of it, the children began to talk. "What's going to happen? Around the rotary and up and over the overpass, the children began to yell, "Wee! Please, sir," to the robber. "Oh, I feel sick." "Me too, sir." "And me." "Not me, sir." "Nor me. I'm never sick." "Oh, silence," growled the robber. But the children were now so noisy they couldn't hear him. "Please, sir, Tracy's got my swimming goggles." "Oh, Jonathan took my towel." "Brian's eating, sir. Are we nearly there now?" The robber felt trapped. He put his hands over his ears. "Oh, this is worse than being in jail," he thought. Meanwhile, Mr. Blotter was smiling. "Please, sir." The noise grew louder still. "Please, sir, he's got my—" "Oh, Mr. Robber, yeah." "No, I never—" "Yes, you did it. He started it. That's not fair." "Mr. Robber, stop pushing." Meanwhile, Mr. Robber was unhappy. He looked out into the crowded, peaceful street, and, "Stop the bus!" he cried. Chapter 8. Mr. Gaskett Lends a Hand. Mr. Gaskett was racing along. He was a worried man. What was Mrs. Gaskett up to? Why was she chasing that bus? Mrs. Gaskett was also racing. She was a worried woman. What was that robber up to? What was he going? Where was he going? With Gus and Gloria? Suddenly the bus stopped. Out jumped the robber, closely followed by Mr. Blotter, the driver, and 27 children, all yelling, "Stop him! He's getting away! Tracy's got my hairbrush!" The robber was little. The robber was quick. He twisted and turned and ducked and weaved and nearly got away. The children couldn't catch him. The police couldn't catch him. Mrs. Gaskett couldn't catch him. The robber ran out into the parking lot. "I'll steal a car," he thought. "I'll get away. This pizza's good." Suddenly, there was Mr. Gaskett. "Out of my way," growled the robber. "No," said Mr. Gaskett. "I may be little," growled the robber, "but I'm tough." The robber tried to run around Mr. Gaskett, but Mr. Gaskett was too wide for him. He tried to punch Mr. Gaskett, but Mr. Gaskett didn't feel a thing. He tripped over his own enormous bag and fell down flat. Mr. Gaskett sat on him. Chapter 9. What Horace Saw. Moments later, when the police and the children and the Christmas shoppers and Mrs. Gaskett and Gus and Gloria and the TV reporter with her cameraman and sound engineer arrived, all hot and out of breath, there was the flat and captured robber, and there was Mr. Gaskett, cool and calm and eating pizza. Then the police grabbed the robber. Mrs. Gaskett hugged Gus and Gloria. Mr. Gaskett hugged Mrs. Gaskett, and Gus and Gloria hugged him. Meanwhile, at his friend's house, live on TV, Horace saw it all. "I know them," he cried. "No, you don't," said his friend. "Yes, I do. They live in my house." "No, they don't." "Yes, they do. It's Mr. and Mrs. Gaskett, and Gus and Gloria." Horace purred with pride. "I'm their cat." Back at the parking lot, the police and the TV reporter were asking questions, and Gus and Gloria mostly were answering them. "He's our dad." "She's our mom." Mr. Blotter was marching the other children back to the bus. The robber was on his way to jail. There was talk of a reward. Suddenly, Mr. Gaskett looked at his watch. "Oh, no," he cried. Is that the time? I've got to go." Mr. Gaskett kissed his wife and children. "Goodbye, darlings." "Bye-bye, Dad," and hurried off. Chapter 10. Mr. Gaskett Goes to Work. Mr. Gaskett was driving along. "Soon be there now," he said to himself. He switched on the radio. "Robbery gets clean away, police baffled," and switched it off again. "I really must get that radio fixed," thought Mr. Gaskett. Mr. Gaskett turned left, drove past an automatic barrier, and into a parking lot. He squeezed out of his car and hurried into an elevator. Up went Mr. Gaskett. First floor, second floor, third floor, fourth floor. Mr. Gaskett entered a small room. He grabbed the kettle and made a quick cup of tea. He looked at his watch. What a rush, he thought. Mr. Gaskett got ready. He put on his red working pants and his red working coat, his red working hat and gloves, his black working boots, and his white working whiskers. "Ho, ho, ho!" cried Mr. Gaskett, and he went to work. Chapter 11. Mr. Gaskett Comes Home. Mr. Gaskett sat on his throne with children. He was a perfect helper for Santa, kind and comfy, like a big, soft bed. At 5:30, Mr. Gaskett came home. He took off his plastic raincoat, his overcoat, his fleece, his jacket, his 3 scarves, his 2 pairs of gloves. "Cup of tea, Dad?" said Gloria. He took off 4 sweaters and a tie, 2 shirts, and a pair of pants. "Evening paper, Dad?" Gus said. Mr. Gaskett sat in his chair. He drank his tea and read the paper. "Father Christmas saves the day," said the headlines. That evening, the Gaskitts, all 4 of them, and Horace, watched a sad old movie on TV. They shared the popcorn, wiped their eyes, and waited for the happy ending. The end. You are now leaving a Gaskitts book. Wild and Crazy Story, written by Allan Ahlberg and illustrated by Katharine McEwen, has been The Man Who Wore All His Clothes.